So Baruch Hashem, it's wonderful to be back again after a hafsukkah of Bein Azmanim, in which I was in Chutz La'aretz. And Baruch Hashem, in the Alps, we had a great olam every night by a shiur. About 100 people came to the shiur every night. We started off every morning after davening with a short Dvar Torah, and then by night the entire crowd came together to hear a lamdish shiur, and it was outstanding. But Ein Torah ke Torah's Eretz Yisrael. And it's always a pleasure to come back to Eretz Yisrael. It's always a pleasure to come back home. It's always a pleasure to come back to the steady shiurim. So Baruch Hashem, we're back. And today was Rosh Chodesh Elul, a very special day, beginning a very special month. So the shiur today is dedicated Elul Lishmosoi of Rabbi Yoel Yankov ben Hagon Atzadik Rabbi Yoel Apian, I understand, is the shver of our dear friend Reb Shimon. Yeah? Shiur Divrei Torah Elul Nishmosoi, Rabbi Yoel Yankov ben Arav Reb Eliyahu. Shiur B'Shalom HaMishkova. You should be a Meretz Yosef for the entire family, and you should only know Nachas and Simcha Kol Hayomim. And we should all be Zoichet to Shana Toiva Mesuka in this coming Shana Habo Aleinu L'Toiva. So the shiur today is in a very special topic, which I have difficulty in defining, but it's a general sugya, which I don't know, I've never seen any forum dealing directly with this question and bringing together various sources and trying to reach conclusions. But the reason the topic is Oila al Shulchan Malachim tonight is because some years ago, in Parsha Shoftim, in this week's Parsha, we deal with how do Jews wage battle or wage wars. And that is in this week's Parsha. And years ago, one of the wars in Eretz Yisrael, I gave a shiur about harming civilians in the course of battle. What is the Torah view? What is the Torah hashkafa? And the shiur I said is actually printed in Minchas Osher Devorim Siman Lamed Beis in this week's Parsha. And one of the comments I made in that shiur, and it is printed in Minchas Osher Siman Lamed Beis in Chumash Devorim, was that we have very few sources in Sifrei HaPoskim dealing with Hilchas Machoma for a very simple reason. For the past 2,000 years, Klal Yisrael did not wage wars. We were the victims of many wars and many persecutions and very many terrible decrees, but we did not have the responsibility of waging war since Churban Bayis Sheni. So the entire magnificent period of Torah Shebal Peh, from the Mishnah up to our generation, the poskim did not deal with Hilchas Malchama. So I wrote that we have no other option but going all the way back to the Tanakh, looking for sources how Jews wage war. So I was approached by a Choshev Talmud Chochem that asked me, could one conclude from that siman in Minchas Osher, Devorim Siman Lamed Beis, that it is legitimate to learn halachas from the Tanakh, from Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, or is the Mishnah and the Gemara the sole and only source to learn halacha? Could one go all the way back to Tanakh to learn halacha? Is the Tanakh at all a halachic source? That seems to be the case, judging from Minchas Osher and Devorim Siman Lamed Beis. So let me just share with you what my response is and what my hashkafa is regarding. Could one learn halachas from the Tanakh? I obviously was very careful when I wrote whatever I wrote, and I didn't even recall, but when I went over that siman again, it was evident to me and obvious that I was cautious when I wrote what I wrote in the first place. And what I wrote there is that we do find in many sources in Rishonim and Achronim that learn halachas from Tanakh, heiche shehoyu nera lehem b'savora. So I definitely would not learn halachas in Hilchas Issa v'Heter or in Hilchas Shabbos from the Tanakh. But I think we do find various different sources, and just out of my memory, I scribbled down 8 sources, which we will deal with tonight at this present shiur, in which we find in the Rambam and in even Achronim that learned halachas from Tanakh. But I think that it is only halachas which they felt miyoshar hadas v'hasavora are correct, and they brought me'ein raya or me'ein smach v'remes b'divrei haTorah hanavim v'aksuvim, but I really do not think that the Tanakh is a halachic source. Halacha by its very nature is based on the Mishnah and the Talmudim, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and the interpretation of the great Rishonim and the commentaries on those sources. So I say b'derech melitza, we don't really know how to learn the Tanakh. We try to understand how the Rishonim learned Tanakh, how Chazal learned Tanakh. I would go to the extreme and say we don't even know how to learn Gemara. We try to understand how Rashi and Tosfos and the Ramban and the Rashba understood the Gemara. So what do we do with the Yerushalmi? We have no Ramban, no Rashba, no Rashi, no Tosfos and the Yerushalmi. So the only thing we really understand is the Yerushalmi. Because in the Yerushalmi, we have no one to guide us. You know, it's only Achronim. We don't have the great Rishonim, and that is why we get so complicated when it comes to understanding the Yerushalmi. So let's directly deal with a basic topic that we are studying tonight. So we do find twice in Yerushalmi, Mesechet Peyed Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph and Mesechet Chagigah Daf Zayin Amud Beis, Ein lemeiden halacha min ha'agoda. That is not a principle that we find in Bavli, but we do find it in Yerushalmi twice, as I quoted, Ein halameiden halacha min ha'agoda. And there's a big machlokes, two different opinions, the great Achronim. Shvus Yankov on one hand, Rabbi Yankov Reisher, going back more than 300 years, and the Noda B'Yehuda on the other hand. So the Noda B'Yehuda was a generation or two after the Shvus Yankov, but they are the great Achronim. So the Shvus Yankov maintains, Chelek Beisim Akuf Ayin Ches, that when Chazal say, Ein meiden halacha mepi agoda, it is only if the agoda is contradicted by halacha. If there are halachic sources that contradict the agadaic sources, so halacha has the upper hand. So if we have a stira between Medrash Rabbah and Shas Bavli, or between the Tanchume and the Yerushalmi, then the halachic sources override the sources that are not halachic by their very nature. But if we have no contradiction, one could learn halacha even from sources that are by nature agadata and not halacha. That is the opinion of the Shvus Yankov. The Noda B'Yehuda has a different opinion. He does not bring the Shvus Yankov. You know, I put them together. I made this shidduch. But the Noda B'Yehuda Yoredei, Madurat Tenyon, Kuf Samach Aleph, makes it very clear. When the Yerushalmi says, Ein lemeiden halacha mepi agoda, it means that agada is not a legitimate source to learn halacha, regardless of whether there is a contradiction between agoda and halacha. Even if there is no stira in Bavli, Yerushalmi, other halachic sources like the Safri, the Safro, we cannot learn halachas from Midrashim. That is the opinion of the Noda B'Yehuda. But they deal with sources of Agadat, which are Midrash Chazal. Anything like Medrash Rabbah, the Tanchuma, or related sources. They do not deal with Torah, Nevi'im, V'Ksuvim. And I think that is a different principle. So when one says, Ein lemeiden halacha mepi agoda, we could understand it in many ways. But, you know, the Ramban writes, and the Maharal, the entire approach to interpreting Agadata, there are different approaches and different opinions. And many argue that Agadas Chazal are b'derech Moshe lemelitza, and it is only b'derech remez. When we're dealing with Torah, Nevi'im, V'Ksuvim, it's a different principle. I think it has nothing to do with the machlokes between the Achronim and the two different sources in Yerushalmi, she'ein lemeiden halacha mepi agoda. The reason we cannot learn from Tanakh is we don't know. We don't have the tools to interpret the Tanakh. And we will see as we move forward, we will see in different examples how problematic it is. But I think the topic we are discussing tonight, could we learn halacha from Torah, Nevi'im, V'Ksuvim, is not the same as we find in Yerushalmi, Ein lemeiden halacha mepi agoda. By their very nature, two different topics, and they are not one and the same. I also want to comment, even though the Yerushalmi says, Ein lemeiden halacha mepi agoda, But the Birkei Yosef, the Chido, in his Sefer on Shulchan Aruch, the Birkei Yosef, Orech Chaim Simerei Yud Ches. And the same comment we find by Reb Shloime Kluger in Chochmas Shloime, Orech Chaim Simen Shin Yud Aleph, both say, we cannot learn halacha from Agadata, but we could learn halacha from Ma'aser Rav that we find in Midrash Agoda. So when in Medrash a story is told of one of the great giants of Yemei Tanoim or Yemei Amiroim, that could be a source to learn halacha, because we do not question stories that are told in Medrash. They are definitely true and authentic. So we cannot learn halacha from pirushim that we find in Medrash or ma'amorim that we find in Medrash, but we could lean and bring halachic significance out of Ma'aser Rav, stories that are told in Midrash on the Hanog of Tanoim v'Amiroim are a legitimate source to learn halacha. That is what the Chido in Birkei Yosef and Reb Shloime Kluger make clear. So let's go back to our basic topic. And I started today's Shiur by quoting the Minchas Osher and the Devarim Simon Beis. We're dealing with questions of battle and war. The question the entire world is dealing with, the ethical question of harming civilians in the course of battle, because our enemies, Yamach Shemam, take advantage of the fact that Jews always try to be humane, and we don't want to hurt civilians, and sometimes they take advantage, and they fire out of civilian dwellings and houses, even hospitals or other institutions, taking advantage of the fact that we will not want to harm those innocent people. So the comment I made before, maybe Hilchas Malchama Shani, because we have no other sources to learn Hilchas Malchama. So the Rambam, Hilchas Malcham Perek Vav Halacha Zayin. I will need some Rambams today. Maybe I could have Rambam Shoiftim. That's the last chelek in Rambam. So the Rambam in Hilchas Malachim Perek Vav Halacha Zayin, the Rambam writes that we lay siege to a city or a town, a matzor. So the Rambam writes, Perek Vav Mehilchas Malachim. Hilchas Malachim are also all the dinim of Malchus. One of the halachas of Malchus is how to wage war. So the Rambam writes, Perek Vav Halacha Zayin. Kishetzorim al ir litovsa, when we lay siege to a city to subdue the army in that city. Kishetzorim al ir litovsa, ein makifan oisa ma'ara baruch oiseu, elo mishalosh roch oiseu, umanichin mukum levroyach, lemi sheroitze lehimoret al nafshoi. We cannot blockade a city from all four sides. We need to leave one side open for the innocent people and civilians that want to run, that want to flee, that want to salvage their lives from bombardment or from attack. Then we need to leave one side open. People should be able to escape. Shenemar vayitzba'u al midyon ka'asher tzivu Hashem es Moshe mepi Hashmi alomdu shebikach tzivohu. So the Rambam learns a halacha, and this halacha is nowhere to be found in Mishnah or in Gemara. Shenemar vayitzba'u al midyon. He does quote mepi Hashmi alomdu shebikach tzivohu. So the commentators, the Kesef Mishnah brings Kosav Asmag Isa B'Sifri. That's in the Zifri and Parshas Matas. But the Sifri doesn't teach us a halacha. The Sifri just tells the story. Vayitzba'u al midyon ka'asher tzivu Hashem es Moshe. What was the tzivu Hashem es Moshe? He should leave one side open. So the Rambam learns a halacha that doesn't have a direct source in the Talmud, in Shas, or in Mishnah from the Posuk Vayitzba'u al midyon. However, one could argue, but he does bring a Sifri. So Zafri says that is what they did. But actually the Sifri says that is the interpretation of Ka'asher Tzivu Hashem es Moshe. So that might be considered a source in Sifri, not only a source in Chumash, not only a source in Torah. Because why does the Sifri say that if it's not halacha? It is not just storytelling, but the interpretation of Sifri is Vayitzba'u al midyon ka'asher tzivu Hashem es Moshe. That means they laid siege in the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded Moshe. What was that command? What was that savui? What was that mitzvah? To leave one side open. So one might argue, no, this is not a source from Tanakh. This is a source from Chazal. This is a source from Sifri. Besides the fact, the comment I made before, maybe halachas of Malchama are different, and that is the only source we have. But I think the more powerful argument is this would be considered a source of the Sifri and not only a source of Tanakh. So I wrote an interesting tshuva many years ago, which was not printed yet, maybe in Minchas Osha Shalosh Tshuvas Chelik Daled, who knows, or Hey, or Vov, or Zayin, Shekadosh Baruch Hu Yazor Lanu, Lahagdil Torah U'La'adira. So a very prominent judge in Israel asked for my opinion in a case in which a person murdered his wife. And then there's a fight over custody of the children between the husband's mother, who wants to take care of her grandchildren, and the wife's sister that was killed. Would I give preference to one of the two? So both were checked. Both families are decent families, legitimate, caring, and the authorities feel that they both could deal with the situation and give the children a proper education. Would I take into account the fact that the husband's family is actually he murdered his wife? Would it be fair to her memory and to her that the children should grow up with his family, and we could have no control what they will tell their children about their mother, or what transpired, what happened? Is that something that we should take into account? And the other question was, is he entitled to Yerusha? So I have no halachic source, but most of us would remember the story told with Achav and Navot HaYisraeli and the terrible plot of Izebel, Eshes Achav. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks Achav, Al Yedei Eliyahu Hanovi, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta. So Achav wanted the vineyard. Did I pronounce the word in the right way? Yeah. So Achav wanted the vineyard of Novoisai Israeli. And Nova says, no, that is Nachlas Avoisai. I don't sell the inheritance from our family. So Achav brings about, in a terrible way, the demise of Novoisai Israeli. And Izebel tells Achav, it's yours. You know, this vineyard is yours for free. You wanted to pay, and I got it for you for free. He's no longer amongst the living. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends Eliyahu Hanavi to ask and reprimand Achav. Aratzachta v'yegam yarashta. So there's a machlokes in the Gemara in Sanhedrin Mem Ches Amud Beis. Why was Achav entitled to get that vineyard by the mere fact that Novois was killed? What makes him entitled to get that field, to get that vineyard? So there are two different opinions in Sanhedrin Mem Ches Amud Beis. One says, Haruge Malchus, Yerushosan lemelech. Achav was the king, and Novois was destroyed by the king's decree or by the queen's decree. And Haruge Malchus nechseim lemelech. The other opinion, the Gemara says, they were relatives, and Achav destroyed Novois and his children, and he was next of kin. And as a Yorush, he was entitled to get that Yerusha. So, Achav was happy. He got that vineyard because he was next of kin and he was the Yorush, or because Haruge Malchus nechseim lemelech. But then the Navi asks him, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta. So is this a raya that a murderer is entitled to get Yerusha, or is it a raya that he is not entitled to get the Yerusha? So obviously, by pure legal and halachic definition, yes, he was the Irish. But nevertheless, the Navi is not happy about the situation, and the Navi asks Yaakov, "Haratzachta v'gam yirashta." So that would be my source, and say no. I don't think he is entitled to get the Yerusha of the person he murdered, he destroyed. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu would send Eliyahu Navi anywhere today, we haven't seen him lately, but if HaKadosh Baruch Hu would send Eliyahu Navi, probably he would send him to ask, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta. Do we have any halachic source dealing with this very same question? Yes, a very interesting source. Really interesting. And that is the very last halacha in Hilchas Mamrim. So we still are in Shoftim. The last perek in Hilchas Mamrim deals with the halachas of Ben Soirer umoreh. And the very last halacha in Hilchas Mamrim is halacha Yud Daled and perek Zayin. And this perek deals with the various different aspects, different halachas of Ben Soirer umoreh. Kosav Rambam. Ben Soirer umoreh areu kekol harugei bezdin shememoinom liyorshayim. Ben Soirer umoreh, like any other harugei bezdin, shememoinom liyorshayim sha'af al pi sha'ovev gorem lo iskila hareu yoresh kol nechosav. Actually, the father brought about the demise of this young person, because the father is the one that brings him to Beis Din. He stole from his father and mother, and that is the din of Ben Soirer umoreh. And the Rambam paskins that the father could forego the oynish of Ben Soirer umoreh. The father is entitled to say, "I'm moichel. I don't press charges. I don't want this to happen." But nevertheless, if the father does bring him to Beis Din, the Rambam says, Ben Soirer umoreh areu kekol harugei bezdin shememoinom liyorshayim she'af al pi sha'ovev gorem lo iskila hareu yoresh kol nechosav. So the Rambam writes, this is a revusa. Ze lo muvan me'elav. It doesn't go without saying. Af al pi sha'ovev gorem lo imisa hareu yoresh kol nechosav. What's the chiddush? The Rambam seems to indicate there is room to argue, how could you be entitled to take Yerusha if you brought about his demise? But nevertheless, he is Yiddish. But I would feel, because his father didn't do an Aveda, he's not a killer, he's not a murderer, that's the Din Torah. Well, he could be Moichel, but he doesn't have to be Moichel. And at the end of the day, Beis Din did what they did al pi din Torah. This is a halacha of Ben Soirer umoreh. So the Radbaz writes, what's the revusa? Because maybe the reason the father wasn't moichel is because he wanted that money. So what? If that would be the case, the Radbaz writes, if that would be the case, litakni rabbonon de lo yershano oviv mishum vehiyisem nikiyim. Kumash malon de lo ichad shinen lahocha. No. We trust that the father did what he did out of good virtue and good intentions, because that's mitzvah satayr. But if we would think that the reason the father brought him to Beis Din is because he wanted that money, then Chachamim would be metaken that he doesn't get that money. I think this Rambam, in the interpretation of the Radbaz, is reason enough, and that was my opinion that I wrote to that judge. If I would have the authority, I would say no, he does not get the inheritance. And the same rule would apply when any family member brings about the destruction or the death of a family member, not b'shoigeg, but intentionally. He should not be entitled to get the inheritance. He should not be entitled to get rich by killing and destroying the life of another. So, by pure halachic definition, there is no such halacha. Parshas Nachlois is Parshas Nachlois. Dini Yerusha do not differentiate how a person passed away, whether he was killed, whether he died a natural death, and by whom he was killed. So in Parshas Nachlois, we do not find any exception. However, based on the interpretation of the Radbaz and this Rambam by Ben Saramoira, I would argue, yes, not by pure halachic definition, but by decree, bederech takana, or bederech hefker beis hefker, and taking advantage of the authority we do have as a beis din, I would say, if this was intentional, then we would prevent the killer, the murderer, from his inheritance. Who would we give the money to? The Kupas Gemach of the Shchuna, the local yeshiva, the local cheder? No, next of kin. The one that's in line, the next Yorish, not the one that brought about the demise of another person intentionally. So, this psak, or this recommendation, on one hand, I based on a posik in Novi, Eliyahu Novi, in Sefer Malachim, Aleph, Perek Chof Aleph, posik Yutes, Eliyahu Novi asks Achov, do you think you deserve this money? Do you think you are the one that gets this vineyard? No. Haratzachta v'gam yerashta. But do I have a halachic source besides Sefer Malachim? Well, somewhat of a halachic source. Rambam, the last halacha in Hilchos Mamrim, according to the interpretation of the Radbaz. So that is source number 2. Let's move on to source number 3 in my list. And once again, Rambam, Hilchos Erechin, Perek Vav of Hilchos Erechin. Halacha Lamed? No, not Lamed. Perek Vav Erechin. Lamed Aleph, Lamed Beis, Lamed Gimel. Eino de makne de v'shalei b'li yolam. The Rambam writes, but if a person does a neder on a davar shalei b'li yolam, that is binding. And he has to be mekayim his neder, even though the neder refers to a davar shalei b'li yolam. And the Rambam brings an interesting source. No source in the Gemara. Yankov Avinu. That's the source of the Rambam. Yankov Avinu promises, and he says, Kol asher titen li, aser aneser loch, va'even azois asher samti mitzayve. That would be Beis Elokim. That would be a mizbeach for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself to Yankov, and he says, Asher nudartu li neder. So it is from these psukim that we learn that neder was binding, even, well, it was a davar shel b'li yolam. So the Rambam learns a halacha, a very specific halacha, and this has nothing to do with Melchamas. This is the din in Hilchos Nedorim, neder chal b'davar shel b'li yolam. And what is the source of this halacha? No Mishnah, no Gemara. Yankov Avinu. So maybe Yankov is an exception, because Yankov says Imlov Angarti, and Rashi brings Taryag Mitzvah Shamarti. So if Yankov says, I adhere to Taryag Mitzvahs, so why can't we learn from Yankov? You know, Yankov testifies and he says Taryag Mitzvah Shamarti, but nevertheless, still a Chiddush. I do not want to get into the question today, what is the nature of Kiyum HaMitzvah Shela Oves Ekdoshim? When the Gemara says, Avrom Avinu Kiyum Kol HaTorah Kula Shelo No Afila Erev Tavshilin, there's major discussion between Achronim. Does that mean that Avrom Avinu actually had 2 sets of tefillin Sharashi and tefillin Shabbeinu Tam? Does that mean that he was medaktik in tzitzis niputz lishma, or in matzas mitzvah mishas lisha, or mishas ktsira, shimur? What do Chazal actually mean when they say Kiyum Avrom Avinu Kol HaTorah Kulat Shelo? Now that is a big discussion which we won't get into today. But it is interesting to note that in Perek Vav Erechin, the Rambam learns a halacha from Yankov Avinu. And in Schiris, he learns another halacha from Yankov Avinu. But the halacha that in Hilchos Schiris he learns from Yankov Avinu maybe is not such a big chiddush in the end of Hilchos Schiris. So we learned the end of Hilchos Mamrim, and now we're at the very end of Hilchos Schiris. When the Rambam writes how the employee has to take care of how the employer has to take care of his workers, of his employees. And then the Rambam writes that the employees have to be dedicated and to do their job in the most proper fashion, with total devotion and dedication. So the Rambam writes in the very last halacha, in Hilchas Chidas, Perek Yud Gimel Halacha Zayin, V'chein chayav hapoyel לעבוד בכל כוחוי, שהרי ינקוי וצדק אומר, כי בכל כוחי עבדתי את אביכם, לפיכם not על שכר זויס, אב ביולם הזה שנאמר, ויפרץ הוא איש מועד מועד. So the Rambam writes, it is not only the employer that has to be decent towards his employees, it is also the worker. Chayev לעבוד בכל כוחוי, Shaharei Yankov Tzadik. I think it's the only place we find this title, Yankov HaTzadik. Yosef HaTzadik is common language, but the Rambam uses an interesting Hagdorah for Yankov Avinu. Yankov HaTzadik Ovar, Ki B'kol Koich Yevadis Avichen. And that is the source of this halacha in Rambam. A posuk, Yankov Avinu says, Ki B'kol Koich Yevadis Avichen. And the Rambam also writes that this is a Zgula. לפיכך נוטל שכר זו יישא ביולם הזה שנאמר ויפרוץ הוא איש מאוד מאוד. So we find two halachas which the Rambam proves from Psukim. And interesting, both are Yankov Avinu. So is Yankov Avinu the only model from whom the Rambam learns halachas, or were there other personalities that also had the same schia that the Rambam learns halachas? Well, David HaMelech. David HaMelech. We find the halacha in Rambam that the Rambam learns from David HaMelech, and that is in the beginning of Hilchos Avel, in Dinei Avelus. The Rambam writes, Dinei Avelus are not chal, only after Kvura. It is not from the moment of demise. It is not from the moment of the Ptira. That is the din of Oinen, but no Dinei Avelus. Kosav Rambam. Me'emes sayes chayev odom be'evel. Mishiasosem hagoyla. Ravel calls man shaloi nigbar ameis eno yosa bedova min advorim she'ovel oso behen. Umipnei tam ze rochatz David HaMelech v'sach kishameis hayeled koidim she'yakover. Do we find a source in the Gemara for this halacha? Well, yes. The answer is yes, and that's a Megillah Daf Chav Zayin. However, the Gemara Megillah Daf Chav Zayin doesn't seem to deal with all the Hilchas Avelis in general. The Gemara deals with a very limited halacha. Me'emesei koifen es amitois. Medina de Gemara, there's a concept of kfiyas amito, which we are not noyeg today. And the Gemara deals from what point koifen es amito. The Gemara says Mishiasosam Agoyel. The Rambam argues, the Rambam is Mechadish. This is not only a specific halacha of Kfiyas Amita. This relates to the entire realm of Dinei Avelus. Umenatam ze rochatz David v'sach achrei shemeis hayeled kodem shenikva, and that is the story told in Sefer Shemuel. So the Rambam proves from David HaMelech a halacha in Hilchas Avelus. So even before we move on to additional sources, I once again want to make the comment I made at the beginning of today's Shiur. I do not think we could learn halachas from the Tanakh. However, we do find sources. Up to this point, we're learning Rambam. All the sources we brought are from the Rambam. But I do think it is from the Tanakh that he just brings a smach to halachas that he would be machadish medate. Because after all, taking this last halacha as an example, David HaMelech, we do find in the Gemara, me'emesei koifen es amito, mishiasosem hagoyel. It is just a question of understanding and interpretation. Is that halacha mesiemes a limited halacha of kviyas amita, or does it relate to general dinei avelus? So the Rambam might prove from the story in Sefer Shmuel that this halacha that we find in the Gemara relates to Dinei Avelus in general. But it is not a halacha that is based solely and entirely on the Tanakh in itself. Perek Yud Beis Miyasurei Biyah, halacha Yud. And this is a halacha which for many, many years, up to recently, in our generation, we didn't find this halacha in Rambam. In Perek Yud Beis Meisure Bia, we learned Tes, and then Halacha Yud Aleph. Halacha Yud wasn't found. The censors took it out. Or maybe the Jews that were afraid of the censors. But obviously the censor could read Rambam, but they didn't know how to read Oisias Rashi, the Maggid Mishnah, because nobody took out the Maggid Mishnah. They took out the Rambam. But they left the Maggid Mishnah there. So we always knew from the Maggid Mishnah what's in the Rambam. But in Shabsei Frankel and in the new editions of Rambam, we find this halacha. So the Rambam writes that a Yid that was nichshel ba'avera with a non-Jewish, that person is dinoi b'misa, kiven shaboli yisol tekola aliyoda. And the Rambam proves this halacha from Benois Midian. Kodesh Baruch Hu gave a mitzvah, kol ishu yoda zocher taharoigu, and that is the source of the Rambam, Benois Midian. And the Maggid Mishnah on the spot writes, probably that's Hayroas Shah. It's not a halacha l'doros. We don't find that halacha in any other war. It is only by the story of Midian. Beyond that, every girl that was more than 3 years old was destroyed. So how could we learn from there that Kiven Shaboli Yisol Tekol Al Yoda? So the Maggid Mishnah wonders about the source that Rambam brings. So it seems to be obvious once again that this halacha is based on Svora and not only on the source of Masa of Midian, as many of the previous sources that I brought. So we brought various different halachas from the Rambam, in which it seems to be that the Rambam learned various halachas from the Tanakh. Isira Bia, Schiris, Eirachin, and Ben Soyer Amoira, which is not halacha that we actually find in Rambam, but halacha that I was medayik from the Radbaz in his interpretation of the Rambam, and I myself based what I said on a source from Sefer Malachim, Haratzachto v'gam Yorashto. But we started off today's shiur with the dinam of siege, of Kishetzorim Aloir, that the Rambam learns from Sifri. Do we find later sources of Gedolei Adoros that learned halachas from the Tanakh? Oh, yes, I think quite a few. But on my list for tonight's shiur, I brought two sources, because they are very important and very significant sources. Some Gedolim, just to quote three of the great Gedolim of recent generations, of later generations, the Nitziv in his form, Reb Meir Simcha, and the Marsha. Three of the greatest Gedolim in the past 150 years in different places in their Sforim bring quite a few sources from Torah, Nevi'im, V'Ksuvim to prove halachas, or at least to substantiate halachas. If not to be mechadish, but then to substantiate halachas. But the sources we will bring in the coming moments are two early and very important sources. Tshuvas Maharivail. And this tshuva is quoted in Shulchan Aruch. Yoredes Mishin Samaches B'Sif Aleph. So there's a halacha meforeshes in Masechet Megillah that one cannot derive benefit out of anything that grows in a Beis HaKvoros. If there are trees that bear fruit, you cannot sell that fruit or eat that fruit. You cannot cut down the trees and use the wood. And that is Mishum Kvod HaMeis. It is not also Bahanoah, because Machu Belakaka Einoi Nesor Bahanoah. But it's an Issa D'Rabbanan Mishum Kvod HaMeis. Tshuvas Maharivail deals with a story in which, in some town or city, the mayor or the poritz, in the feudal system, every poritz was a king. And he had herds of animals, and they used to pasture, whether I got the right word. Hem ra'u bebeis hakvoros. What's the word? Graze, yes. And those animals used to graze in the beis hakvoros, and it was awful. So the Marivail Paskin, we could cut down the trees, sell the wood, to bribe the mayor to take his animals out, or to build a fence and keep those animals out. So the argument of Marivail is the entire issue is mishum kvoid hameis. But this is far more awful, having animals grazing in the basic laws. So we could be over on an issue based on kvoid hameis to minimize the bizoyin of the Mesim. Where does he prove this halacha? From Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda. And if I'm not mistaken, sometime a while ago I discussed this tshuva. Please revive my memory, I think so. So the story of Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, shekitzes dal sahechel, and he sent dal sahechel to Melech Ashur to appease him. He shouldn't conquer Yerushalayim and he shouldn't destroy the Beis HaMikdash. So Marivail learns a halacha from Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda. Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda cut off Dal Sazaychel and he sent them as a gift to Melech Ashur. So what he wants to learn from Chizkiyahu is Chizkiyahu was over on an Issa D'Oraisa, lo tasum kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. You cannot destroy any part of the Beis HaMikdash. V'yibadetem eshamam lo tasum kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. But to minimize the churban of Beis HaMikdash, he was over on an Isra of lo tasum kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. And this is the source from which Marivail proves his point. The last source is a very interesting one, dealing with the Geniza. And obviously this was always a problem, going back 300 years. And once again, the Shivus Yankov. Shuvas Yankov, Chele Gimel, Siman Yud, Yud Aleph, Yud Beis. We find a major argument between two Gedei Lador. Rabbi Yankov Reisha, Shivus Yankov, and Rabbi Cheskel Katzanel Bogen, Shalosh Shuvas Knesset Yecheskel. So the Shvus Yankov writes that in their city, and also in the previous city where he was Rav, which was Prague, they had a major problem with Geniza. So much Geniza was accumulated that it couldn't be taken care of. So by halachic definition, we're supposed to bury the Geniza in the basic forest, but there was no longer enough space. And if that was a problem in Prague 300 years ago, today, it's a momentous problem because the amount of Geniza that we generate and we produce is unbelievable. It's hundreds of tons every month because there is so many Sefer Kodesh being printed. And just take every shul, Alonei Shabbat, and the newspapers of the weekend, from newspapers, so much Divrei Torah, that there's an unbelievable amount of Geniza that we generate. So the Shvus Yankov Paskin, which seems to be a tremendous chiddush, that it's better burning the shemus than not being able to take care of them b'derech koved. It's preferable to burn. How could we burn? Isn't that a lav d'oraisa? No. The lav d'oraisa refers only to shemus, m'shemus hakodesh yenim nemchokim. But divrei Torah that do not include shemos mifaroshim, there is no lav d'oraisa. But it is an issur of bizayin. So the Shvus Yankov argues, if we're dealing with bizayin, it is a far greater bizayin having that Geniza all over the place. Lemir mastachas araglayim would be more mechubit to burn it. After all, there's a din of seifes kodshim, writes the Shvus Yankov. There's a din of seifes kodshim. Kodshim are holy. It's kodshim, but there is a din of seifes kodshim. So we would be better off burning the Geniza than not being able to take care of it b'derech koved. And the Knesset Yecheskel totally rejects his opinion. What is very interesting is the Chazon Ish, because in my eyes the Chazon Ish is the supreme authority. The Chazon Ish doesn't quote it, neither the Shus Yankov nor the Knesset Yecheskel. He didn't. The Chazon Ish was not a great bookie in Achroinim, but he relates to the same question. And in Chazon Ish, Yoredei Kuf Samach Daled, Ois Gimel, he writes, maybe it is better to burn than being mevaze Geniza. So, at this very moment, at this year, I'm not dealing halacha l'maisa with this question. Maybe at some other opportunity we will, but not right now. What is the source of the Shus Yankov when he says it's preferable to burn than having the shemis Magila de Bezoyin? Very surprising. Shaul HaMelech committed suicide because he didn't want to fall liyad ha'pelishtim, shemi yit'alelu bo ha'pelishtim. So he preferred ending his own life rather than the pelishtim should be mevaza, the body of Melech Yisrael. So the Shus Yankov writes, we could learn from Shaul HaMelech. If he decreed, and he paskined, that one could take his life lest the pelishtim be mevaza Melech Yisrael, that it would be preferable to burn the shemis to prevent the bezoyin of shemis, which is a far-fetched raya. And the Knesset Yecheskel rejects this raya. We could argue against this proof in many different ways, but I'm just noting the fact that this is a shal of Isa v'Heter. This is a shal in Dinei Sefer Torah. And the raya he brings is the story told in Sefer Shmuel about the demise of Shaul HaMelech, which is all the way back to Tanakh, all the way back to Sefer Shmuel to prove a halacha in Dinei Bezoyin Kisvei Kodesh, which is very surprising. So after all these sugyas that we dealt with in an individual basis, I once again want to make my basic argument. I think if we once again revisit each and every one of these psukim, my feeling is that these great psukim, from the Rambam all the way down to the Shus Yankov, we're dealing with sugyas in which the conclusion is a logical one, and it has a basis in Svara Yeshora, in halachic definition, and the various different gedolim. B'chol zois wanted to find a source, because we never feel comfortable in being mechadash halacha min hasvara belvad, and that is the netiyah of poskim, from the Rishonim all the way down to present-day poskim, to look for some source upon which to base our halachic rulings and halachic chidushim. But I do feel that the Tanakh is not the halachic source, and we need to derive and learn halacha from Gemorahs and from the poskim, and not going all the way back to the Tanakh. But we do find, as I brought 8 or 9 different sources from the Rambam up to the Achronim, in which we do find here and there some novel halachic rulings which the great halachic authorities did base on various different passages and various different parashas and psukim from Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. So I felt that this would be an interesting topic to speak about, and I'm not aware of any of the Achronim that brought together sources dealing with this fundamental question in Darkei HaPsika, in Darkei Halacha, and Darkei HaPsak. So today was Rosh Chodesh Elul, and as I said at the outset of this year, this is a very special day, because Elul is a very special Chodesh. So there are many Ramozim regarding Elul. Probably the best known is the Remez, Elul is Rosh HaTevis Ani Ledoidi V'Doidi Li. And this Remez first found, to the best of my memory, in Abu Darham. I don't think it's Chazal. But the Abu Darham and Rosh Hashanah brings Amru Hadarashonim. It is also found in Shara Kavonas from the Riyah Kodesh. Ani ledoidi v'doidi li. There are many other Ramazim. Echod lachatos, ve'echad la'asham. And some people might have the impression that somebody just sat down with a Tanakh. If it would be today, he didn't even need a Tanakh. He just sat down with his computer and went through the Tanakh looking for any pasuk that has the sequence of Alav Lamed Vav Lamed. And he came up with a lot of Ramazim. No, Chas v'Sholem, no. These Ramazim that are found in Kisvei Ari have a profound significance in Pnimius. It's not just by chance. And I think that the Remez, Ani ledoidi v'doidili, is truly profound. Because in our conscience and our thoughts, Elul brings to mind Emes Yoim Hadin, Midas Hayira. Minhag Ashkenaz to blow shofar every day of Chodesh Elul. This morning we all heard the shofar. Maybe not all of us, but most of us, the Ashkenazim amongst us. And what is Tkiyah shofar about? The Navi comments, Hayatuk shofar be'ir va'am lo yechradu. So shofar mar'id et ha'meitarim shebelev. And it is all about fright and flight. So this Remez comes to teach us Elul is not only about Yira, it is first and foremost about Ahava. Because the Posuk Ani ledoidi v'doidi li is not in Megillas Eicha, it's not in Sefer Iyov. Where is this Posuk? It's in Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim is not really about Yira, it is all about Ahava. The Rambam in Perek Yud of Hilchos Tshuva, the entire Perek Yud of Hilchos Tshuva is dedicated to Midas Ahava. And the Rambam exalts Avodas Hashem Yahava. The Rambam writes, Loi kol hachasidim zochu lamala zu. That is the mal of Avraham Avinu shekoroi Hanovi Yeshayahu Oihev Shenem Azera Avraham Ohavi. And the Rambam writes, Kol sefer Shir HaShirim nichtav kemoshol le'inyan hazeh. That is the story between the Dod and the Raya, between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael. Shir HaShirim is the story of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love for his children and our love of Avinu Shebashamayim. That is the story of Shir HaShirim. And that is where we find Ani ledoidi v'doidi li. And this comes to teach us Elul is not only about Yiro, it is more about Ahava. And Elul is a gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us bechemlosoi oleinu. Out of his love for us and out of his caring, he gave us Chodesh Elul. That is a month of preparation. We should be zoicha to aksiva v'chasim and taiva, and to midas harachamim, and not midas adin. That is ani ledoidi v'doidi li. So this posuk is found in Shir HaShirim in two different versions, Perek Beis and Perek Vav. The formulation in Perek Beis is doidi li v'ani lo. It is only in Perek Vav that we find Ani ledoidi v'doidi li. Is there a difference between the two versions? Obviously there is. Doidi li v'ani lo would indicate that HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes the first step. First, the Dad is the one that makes the first step to the Raya. But the other version is Ani ledoidi v'doidi li, which seems to suggest that we are the ones that have to do the outreach, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one that responds. Ani ledoidi v'doidi li. And the Medrash in Parshas V'Zoysa Brocha says that is the eternal argument between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael. In our tefillas we ask, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'noshuva. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Torah says, Shuvu Elai v'ashuva Elechem. You are the ones that have to initiate, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shuvu Elai v'ashuva Elechem. We would very much request Hashivenu v'noshuva. So Hasidim tell the story of the Rav Asher Weiss Shlit. The Rav Asher Weiss Shlit was one of the great tzaddikim more than 200 years ago. So as the story goes, his Balagala once was traveling and he was sitting back in the wagon, and the Balagala with the two horses up front, and they got stuck in the mud in the middle of Poland in Rapshitz, in the middle of the winter. So the Balagola goes out and he's pushing and shoving and huffing and puffing, but to no avail. He can't get the wagon out of the mud. So he walks over to the Rebbe's window and he says, Rebbe, I'm an old Balagola. I know it's a pasnisht. I know that a Rebbe is not supposed to be standing out in the rain and the mud and pushing. But toivim hashnayim and oechad, I'm doing my best and not making any headway. So maybe the Rebbe should come out and maybe we'll push together and maybe we'll get somewhere. So what could he say? So the Rebbe leaves the shelter of the wagon and he stands out there in the mud and the rain and they're both pushing and shoving. And then the Rav Shetzarov looks up at the heavens and says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I know that I'm stuck in the mud and I know it's Hashgacha Protis. I know you expect me to do tshuva. But how could one do tshuva when he's wet and cold and standing up to his knees in the mud? It's hard to do tshuva in these circumstances. Take me home. I'll shower up. I'll have a hot tea, and I promise to do tshuva. And the Hasidim knew that the Rav Shetzarov called the Vorav b'moshel u'b'melitza, and he wasn't speaking about his own personal predicament, but rather about Klal Yisrael. And he says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rabbeinu Shalom, we're stuck in the mud for the past 2,000 years. And we know there's a reason to it. We got to do tshuva. You've been saying for a while, Shuvu elai v'ashuvu elechem, but how could we do tshuva when you're stuck in the mud and it hurts and you're suffering and you're pained and it's cold? And bring us home. Bring us home, and we promise to do tshuva. Hashivenu Hashem elecho v'nashuva. So if it would be up to us, this month would not be named Elul. We would prefer that this month should be called Dalul. Al Shema Posuk, Doidi li va'ani lo. That would be our preference, but it's not up to us. And the name of this month is not Dalul, it is Elul. It's the other Posuk, second one. Ani le doidi, and only then doidi li. And it is a Kodesh Baruch Hu that insists, Shuvu elai v'ashuv aleichem. So I'm a disciple, I'm a Talmud of the Kloisenberger Rebbe, and he was such an unbelievable tzaddik, and sometimes he was matiach devorim klape mala. The way he spoke to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I didn't know anyone that dared. And I remember him once saying, Rabbeinu Shalom, if you think this is going to work and we're going to do tshuva out here in Golas, no, it ain't working, he said. You've been trying this for 2,000 years and you've got nowhere. He says, it just isn't working. And I remember the Kloisenberger Rebbe saying, I was in Auschwitz. Nobody did tshuva in Auschwitz. I was shocked at the time. That is what he said. I was there. Nobody did tshuva in Auschwitz. Rabbeinu Shalom. This isn't working. Bring us home. Bring us home and we'll do tshuva. The Kloisenberger Rebbe said, like the Rav Shetzarov said 200 years earlier. But it is HaKadosh Baruch Hu that decides. And it's all about Ani ledoidi v'doidi li. Shuvu elai v'ashuv aleichem. And we have to take the first step. Kodesh Baruch Hu doesn't expect that much. Pischulu Pesach kechudosh shel machat. And everybody remembers what Chazal say? Unless you remember the shiur I gave a year ago. So what do Chazal say? Pischuli Pesach kechudosh shel machat v'ani eftach. No. That's nowhere in Chazal. Everybody quotes that. It's in the Shlo, but it's not in Chazal. So everybody says, Pischuli Pesach kechudosh shel machat v'ani eftach elom Pesach pischuli shel ulam. That's nowhere in Chazal. The proper formulation of the Ma'amar Chazal is a medrash in Shir HaShirim. Pischuli Pesach kechudosh shel machat v'ani eftach lachem ptachim shu agolois v'kroinois ovrim behem. That's far better. And I say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't deal with empty agolos v'kroinois. His agolos v'kroinois are never empty. They are overfilled and overburdened with Shefa Eloki, with Bona, Chayim, Ezayna Revicha, Nachas and Simcha. Beruchnius uvegashmius. All we need to do is pischu li pesach kechudosh shel machat. ואני אפתח לכם לא פתח אחד, אלא פתחים רבים, שיהיו הגולויס וקרוינויס עוברים בהם. But we need to initiate, and we need to come back to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. And that is why Kodesh Baruch Hu gave us Chodesh Elul. Ani ledoidi v'doidi li. So this is the month in which each and every one of us has to do his cheshbon nefesh and try to come closer. Try to open that little door that a Kodesh Baruch Hu wants to see in our hearts. Pischu li pesach kechudosh shel machat. And then we will be zoiche shekodesh Baruch Hu yiftach lanu ptachim shu agolois v'kroinos ovrim behem. So we should all take advantage of this great month, of the shofar that we hear every morning. We should take advantage of Chodesh Elul. Try to come closer to our Kodesh Baruch Hu with tshuva, with tefillah, with tzedakah. And a Kodesh Baruch Hu should give us, together with Kol Beis Yisrael, Aksiva v'chasim etoiva besifron shel tzadikim gemurim. Shi'eh shana dois, habo aleinu l'toivo, shi'eh shnas ge'ula v'yeshua, b'bias goyel tzedek, b'mheiro v'yomeinu, amen.